And now, marine weather around Alaska.
All right, today's sea ice analysis showing ice continuing to form here along the Arctic coast, mostly inside the barrier islands there on the east side, extending back toward the central coast, and then to a much lesser extent here on the western Arctic coast. And still some ice there in Kotzebue Sound and in Norton Bay as well. So moving on from this to tonight's weather forecast, we've got a winter weather advisory out for the Klondike Highway on up to Skagway in the Haynesboro area for 2 to 6 inches of snow tonight, with winds gusting to 35 miles an hour out of the north here. Otherwise, rain and gusty winds for the remainder of the Panhandle tonight, with that front right off the coast there. Clear and cold interior Alaska, gusty northeast winds here, Matanuska Valley, Prince William Sound area in the North Gulf Coast. Otherwise, light winds over the interior all the way up into the North Slope, but blizzard warning continues for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tonight for winds gusting to 55 miles an hour, blowing snow, visibilities down to a quarter mile or less at times. Weak thing here, bringing increasing moisture into the St. Lawrence Island area, western Seward Peninsula, and then on up into the Chukchi Sea. A few isolated showers possible here for the Alaska Peninsula, maybe the eastern Aleutians. Otherwise, high pressure, light winds here for the Bering Sea down to the central Aleutians, and some light rain with that weak front there dragging into the western Aleutians. For tomorrow, a weak low develops along that weak front and keeps it kind of wet there from Amchitka Island westward. Otherwise dry under high pressure and light winds for Adak and Atka. That pattern extends up over much of the, all the way up towards St. Lawrence Island and the eastern Bering Sea here. Another mostly sunny, clear day. Chilly temperatures here, Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay. Clear and cold, much of interior Alaska. Look for more clouds though here over the western and northwest part of the state. And that blizzard warning continues to the eastern Arctic coast. And it stays wet over the Panhandle there with the winter weather advisory for the Haynesboro area and the Klondike Highway out until about 1 p.m. And then the outlook for Sunday or Saturday, first day of the weekend here, drying out up in the Lynn Canal Glacier Bay area, and also partly sunny for the North Gulf Coast or the eastern North Gulf Coast, probably mostly sunny back here to the west. Still pretty showery there over the central and southern southeast coast with a weak low off the coast there, and moisture with this front here tracking in, kind of linking up with the former one there. And that brings an area of light snow into the northwest coast and the western interior here, mixing with rain, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta during the day. And high pressure is starting to slip off to the south here as strong southwest flow ahead of that intense storm back over the Russian Far East there pushes a front into the western Bering Sea. And that'll be pushing eastward on Sunday and Sunday night. Coastal water forecast, we've got small craft advisories for the central and south coast for east to southeast winds, 25 to 30 knots. And for the north coast up there, north to northeast winds, 20 to 35 knots. And for Lynn Canal, northwest winds, 30 knots with higher gusts, northeast at 20 knots for Stevens Passage, southeast winds at 30 knots for Clarence Strait with those seas up to 13 feet. And then for the day on Saturday, lighter winds here, especially on the south coast, west-southwest at about 20 knots with seas around 10 feet. Clarence Strait, southwest at 15 knots, and then the central coast out here, kind of a east wind to southwest wind at 20 to 25 knots with those east and northeast winds for the remainder of the coastline at 15 to 25 knots. Lynn Canal, north winds 30 knots, seas 6 feet. Stevens Passage, winds out of the north at 20 knots with 3-foot seas. Prince William Sound, small craft advisories, and Cook Inlet, small craft advisories. North winds in all those areas at 30 knots with seas 6 to 8 feet. And 25 to 35 knot northerly winds for the eastern North Gulf Coast, north at 30 there. For the western North Gulf Coast, gale force northerlies for the Barren Islands, north at 35 knots, northwest 30 knots for Kamishak Bay. And for Saturday, northwest winds continue for Kamishak Bay at 30 knots, as well as the Barren Islands. Lighter winds for Cook Inlet, north 10 to 15 knots with 3-foot seas. And Prince William Sound, north winds at 20 knots, seas 3 feet. And for the Much in the North Gulf Coast, winds will be north at 20 knots. And for Kodiak Island, small craft advisories for Friday, north winds 25 to 30 knots with 5 to 6 foot seas. Alaska Peninsula, north winds 20 to 25 knots. Bristol Bay, winds out of the north at 20 knots. First day of the weekend here for Saturday, Alaska Peninsula, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Northwest at 25 knots for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, northwest winds at 25 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, north winds tomorrow 20 to 25 knots. Light variable winds under high pressure. Excuse me. Under high pressure, winds will be light and variable, 10 knots or less for the central Aleutian areas. And then back to the west here, small craft advisories, south to southwest winds at 20 to 25 knots. Even stronger winds in store for Saturday. We've got gale warnings here for the western Aleutians. South winds 45 knots, seas building to 20 feet. Adak and Atka, southwest winds 25 knots. And then west at 20 for the Fox Islands. Southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island, north winds at 20 knots. Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, west at 10. Norton Sound, south winds 15 knots. West winds at 15 knots for St. Matthew Island, north at 15 for the Pribilofs. And we'll see what Saturday has to offer. Much stronger winds coming into the northern Bering Sea here. St. Matthew Island, gale warnings, winds increasing to 40 knots out of the southwest with seas building to 13 feet. Otherwise, southwest winds at 20 knots for the Pribilof Islands, Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, gale warnings here on the east side at 40 knots out of the west. The east central coast, small craft advisories with west winds at 25 knots. Seas in these areas 5 to 9 feet. 15 knot west winds for the central coast. And then southeast at 10 for the western Arctic coast. The Chukchi Sea, southeast winds 20 to 25 knots with seas 4 to 5 feet. And for Saturday, lighter winds now on the eastern Arctic coast there, down to 20 to 25 knots, still out of the west, seas about 4 to 6 feet. Southeast at 10 knots for the central coast, western coast east at 15 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea, south to southeast winds roughly at about 20 knots or so with 4 to 6 foot seas.